All right guys, I have here a 2006 Toyota Sienna with a 3.3, and of course this van has got knock sensor codes and it needs both knock sensors replaced. So I'm going to go through step by step that repair on this van, and I'm going to show you guys how to get it done. So if you have a Toyota or a Lexus that has either the 3.0 or the 3.3 liter V6, chances are at some point you're going to run into this issue where the check engine light will come on with knock sensor codes. On these engines, it's very common for these knock sensors to fail. And of course, if this happens to you, you're going to experience lack of acceleration. The vehicle may possibly not shift into overdrive, and it's just not going to run too well. Now, if you take your vehicle to a shop to get this issue resolved, you may find out that this is not a cheap job. It can get very expensive very quickly, and there's a lot of variables besides just the knock sensors. Once you open one of these up, there's a lot of parts and other considerations to be made during this job, and it can easily put the bill up into the thousands of dollars. So I'm going to go over all of that here. Okay, first take a 5mm Allen socket and remove these bolts from the engine cover if you haven't done so already, and then go ahead and get this cover out of the way. Okay, next, being that this is a van, I'm going to have to remove this cowling right here where the wipers are, and this entire cowling is going to have to come out to get back to the intake and stuff back there because there's just really no room. Pop these covers off, remove the 14mm nuts. Next, close the hood, pull the wiper arm up, wiggle it back and forth until you're able to pop it free and lift it out. Okay, now with the hood open again, you'll notice that right here there are a series, well not this one, but right here there's a series of tabs. They go all along here. They need to basically be depressed, and then at that point you can lift up on this cowling and it'll pop free. Okay, once you have the front of the cowling loose, come over here on each corner, make sure that these little corner pieces are removed from the tabs here. Do the same over here, make sure that it's free. Then simply lift up and pull the cowling straight out. And then go ahead and get it out of your way. Okay, next we got to remove the wiper motor and the wiper transmission. So go ahead and unplug it. And then remove the 4 10mm bolts, one here, one there, and then the 2 right there. Okay, let's get this wiper motor and transmission removed. Set that out of the way. Okay, next, this wiring harness here, there's a tab here, there's one here, one here. So I'm gonna disconnect all that, and then I'm gonna fish it back out through this little grommet where it goes into the metal cowling here. Okay, so now I'm gonna get that disconnected, fish this harness out of the way. Okay, I've got this wiring harness pulled out and out of the way. So now there's a series of 10mm bolts all around here that hold the cowling in place. So just go through, find them all, and remove them. Okay, so I counted 8 bolts that I had to remove. I didn't have to take this one out, just the one that's back there only. So this whole deal should come out now. Okay, now I've got all the room I need on this van and I'll be able to do what I need to do. So ultimately, of course, the goal here is to get to the knock sensors, which are way underneath the lower intake. So to get the lower intake off, we got to remove the upper intake. And to get the upper intake off, we're gonna have to start removing the air box, throttle body boot, and all this other stuff. So let me get this piece off first. Got the 2 10s out, pull this out of the way. And I like to put these bolts back where they go, that way they don't get lost or misplaced. Okay, next let me remove this 10mm here, the one back there. I'll undo the 10 here and undo the mass airflow sensor and get this air box off. And then of course there's these little vacuum hoses on the side of the box. Some models have 4 hoses, this one only has 3. Well, it came off from here, I guess that's fine. And these, usually from the factory, it's marked with yellow paint. That way you know which one goes where. Okay, all this is unplugged, the mass airflow, everything. So let me get this off. Let me get the air filter out. Wow, that needs to be replaced. Okay, next I'm gonna remove this whole box. And I recommend you do this to get access to some of this stuff back here. So there's a 10 here, there's a 10 here, and a 10 there. So there's 3 10mm bolts that have to be removed. And before we get those out, I'm just gonna disconnect the purge valve here. Okay, this box should come out. Sometimes this tube down here gets a little bit stuck. There. Okay, next I'm gonna wanna remove this breather hose here, and then this whole boot right here needs to be removed. Okay, one thing to consider during this job, a lot of times these hoses, they get very hard and brittle, and when you take them off, or actually more specifically when you go to put them back on, they tend to split a crack right down the side. So now would be the time to decide if you want to go ahead and replace this breather hose as well. I'll see if it cracks and then I'll make my decision. Another thing too to consider is these boots right here, they tend to crack right in between here. And so if they split open, either this one or this one right here, then you're gonna get air getting in there while the engine's running, and you're probably gonna get a check engine light with some lean codes or possibly some mass airflow codes. This one looks okay as far as I can tell. When I get it off, I'll look all the way around, but that's one thing to keep in mind. So let me get this removed here. Yeah, and it's starting to split a crack like I said, so I may have to replace this hose. I don't want to get a lean condition afterwards. And this is the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Once you get in here to do this job, you know, you think you're going in just doing knock sensors, and then other stuff like this happens, it's going to add a little bit of cost to the job. So keep that in mind before you begin. Let me get this off. This removed and out of the way. I noticed too, some of these vacuum hoses like this one right here, see how it's split and it's cracked, but it wasn't giving me any issue before. So some of these hoses, golly, these things are brittle, man. On these hoses being so brittle, man, I would try my best to not disturb as much of it as you possibly can, because if you go in and start disturbing all that, then those hoses are gonna break and you're gonna have to replace them. Anyway, I'm gonna get that throttle body off next. So this breather hose here that looks extremely dry rotted, I'm gonna pull this off and hopefully I don't destroy it. Okay, I think it'll be all right. And this one right here that goes to the brake booster. Okay, got that off. Okay, now let me get the throttle body disconnected here. I'm gonna go ahead and remove these. They do contain coolant. I don't know if any coolant will come out of this one though, because I also did a radiator on this van and I have not put coolant back in it, so it may be empty. Well, that one's dry. Let me grab this clamp and set it aside before I lose it. Next. Okay, next I'll remove the 410s and get the throttle body off. And that's another thing, you will need a new throttle body gasket. Now this piece right here, it does remove from the intake manifold, but I would leave it alone and just remove it with the intake manifold as one piece. And this is actually funny, so let me show you guys something. Right back here, there is supposed to be, look at this little bracket here, and it's supposed to bolt up to the back of the intake right there. So there's supposed to be a bolt here And look at this other one over here that's just loose. It's not even attached. This one's supposed to go further down toward the passenger side. It's supposed to go way over here and bolt to the back of the intake. But almost every single time I see one of these vehicles that's been worked on previously, nobody ever puts these bolts back where they're supposed to go, because they're such a pain to get to if you don't remove all this stuff to get to them. So most people just say, screw it, I'm not even gonna bother putting it back, which that's not what we're gonna do today. The manufacturer put these there for a reason. So before it's all said and done, I'll get all this put back where it goes. But if yours has never been touched, there's gonna be, I think it's either a 12 or a 14 that goes here, a little bolt. And so then I guess the one on the side and then that one is gonna be the middle one. So those aren't connected. The one on that side is still there though. So I'll need to get that out. And you know what? Guys, now that I look at this third bar back here is not even connected either, man. Whoever worked on this did not give a rip. Well, being that none of those support bars are connected back there, let me just continue on here, and then once we get the intake off, I'll show you where everything goes back there. So let me go ahead and remove this little vacuum tubing here. Okay, next let me come over here and get this one disconnected. Next, there's a 10mm nut here and one right down here on this side. Now this whole deal should just pull off. Truthfully, what I ought to do is remove this one and remove this plug and remove that plug, and I'll just take this whole thing out of the vehicle. Okay, so I did that, and then I actually found this easier to disconnect from back here, so that's what I did. Now I can get this whole deal out of the way here. Okay, next there's a 10mm nut for this ground wire. Gonna set that out of the way. Okay, next there are 4 of these Allen bolts right here. You're gonna need an 8mm Allen socket to remove them. And then on either corner, there's a 14mm nut here and there. There we go. Golly. All right, let's get this bad boy off. You know what, guys, I forgot about the PCV hose that's right back there. So I'm actually gonna need to get that off, and then the intake will come out. There we go. Okay, round 2. All right, guys, so on the bottom of the intake manifold, here's another consideration. This is that PCV hose. I can't even really squish this with my fingers because this hose gets so dry rotted. It won't even really stay on here anymore. So this is getting a new PCV hose, and it's also getting right here a new PCV valve. So just another consideration if you're doing this job, you may want to factor that in there, because if this hose cracks, you're going to get a lean condition. And if you look at the back of the intake manifold, there's the throttle body, obviously. You can actually see the spots where the support brackets are supposed to screw into. So here is 1, 2, 3. All right, guys, and once you get it disassembled to this point, there's just a couple more considerations. On this van, it just so happens that the rear valve cover is leaking oil. Actually, the front one's leaking a little bit too, but not too bad. But if you go underneath the van on the back side of this valve cover in the back, it's definitely running oil all down the side of the motor. So while we have the intake off and everything, now would be the time to go ahead and do the valve cover. So if you're just in here for NOx sensors and you have a leaking valve cover, or maybe you're doing this for a customer, at least give them the option and say, hey, while we're there, do you want us to go ahead and fix your leaking valve cover? If it is leaking, that is, like this one. Another thing to consider too, and I wouldn't really push this too hard with a customer. I may bring it up as an option. I don't really like to upsell or anything like that, but one other consideration, the 3 ignition coils back here behind the intake, These are original. This van has over 200,000 miles, and because these coils are such a pain to get to, you may want to consider putting 3 new coils back here. It would be a good idea. That way you don't have to do all this work all over again if you have a bad coil down the road. Also, the spark plugs back here, if they haven't been done in a long time, you may want to consider doing that as well while you're back here. Now, the 3 coils up here in the front, I'm not too worried about because they're so easy to get to. I mean, it's a 2-minute job to change these ones out. But the ones back here, not so much. And I'm not saying do it or don't do it, guys. I'm just throwing it out there for you guys to consider. Okay, so the next thing we're gonna wanna do is work on getting this lower intake off. But at this point, I will say, if you have not drained the coolant already from the vehicle, you're going to want to do that now. Because if you don't, you're gonna have a huge problem on your hands when you remove this intake. There's a section down here on either corner of the intake where coolant flows through. So if you don't drain your coolant and you remove this, you're gonna get coolant that goes down into your cylinders. Now, the best way to drain coolant on this engine, on either side of the block, if you come down here and look down in there, you'll see there are these little drain cocks on the side of the engine block, and there's one on either side of the engine. And if you can get down there and take a 10mm socket, you can undo that bolt a few turns and you'll be able to drain the coolant that way. Now, if yours are severely rusted up, you may not want to touch them, but in most cases, this is the best way to drain coolant from the block. So let's go ahead and undo all 6 injector connectors. Another thing too about these coils in general is that these connectors on the coils, if you notice, the tab that locks it in place is broken. And pretty much on all these old Toyotas, when you go to remove these coils, the locking tabs are gonna break. As you can see, all of these are broken off. I think there's 1 or 2 in the back that are still intact, but they're probably gonna break when I unplug them. And these connectors, by the way, they sell these at the dealership. If you guys wanna change them out, I'll give you the part numbers right now. And like I mentioned before, if you're back here doing all this work, oh yeah, you see this is already kind of broken anyway. There it goes. Yeah, it's not doing anything. While you're back here doing all this work anyway, that might be something to consider replacing as well, would be these connectors if they're broken. And as you can see, I actually have a bag of them here. And there's the part number right up there. It's a 90980-11885. So if you need these, just go to your local Toyota dealer, give them that part number, and they should have them in stock. And actually right now, when I was taking these injector connectors out, this last injector over here, it moved and then it started spraying gas out of it right there where it goes into the fuel rail. And there's O-rings there that are supposed to prevent it from spraying gas out even if these are to move. So I'm probably gonna wanna put a set of injector O-rings in this thing, because the last thing I want is to put this thing back together and it leaks gas out of there. So just another thing to consider, guys. When you go in for a job like this, you never know what you might find. Usually too, at this point, I recommend putting a towel or something over here. That way, if you accidentally drop a nut or bolt, it doesn't go into the engine. So there's another 10mm nut right here for a ground wire. I gotta get that off. Do not drop the nut in the cylinder. Put that back for now. Next, these heater lines that go to the intake, I'm going to remove these. And if you actually notice, guys, now that I'm looking at this, you see how the clamp is not exactly lined up with the mark on the heater hose? That means somebody's been here and have taken these off before. And these heater hoses are original. They have not been replaced. So the only reason I could think of why somebody would remove this heater hose, and as you can see, they removed this one too, would be to get this intake off. And the only reason I could think of why someone would want to remove this intake would be to get to NOx sensors. So I'm almost willing to bet that once I get all this off, I bet somebody has been here before. I bet these NOx sensors have been replaced. And that's another point that I will get to later in this video. If you do not use OEM factory replacement NOx sensors, you are almost 9 times out of 10 guaranteed to have a problem with them in the future. So once I get this off, I'll get my eye on it and I'll see for sure what kind of sensors are in these, if they're original or if they've been replaced. And based on seeing that, I bet these have been replaced, probably with some cheap aftermarket, and that's probably why I'm having issues with this thing now. And I know this might be a minor thing to some, but when it comes to these clamps, when these clamps do not get put back in exactly the same position they were, it just drives me crazy. It just looks like a sloppy job in my opinion. But obviously, case in point, whoever worked on this before didn't care too much about that, I don't think. Bust these loose. Okay, what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna come over here, and right here is for the fuel line. So I'm gonna disconnect the fuel line so I can remove the intake and the injectors and everything as one assembly. So this kind of just pops out right here where my index finger is. There's a little locking tab now where my thumb is. Pop this out. Okay, get that popped out. Now there's a yellow here and a yellow on the other side. You simply pinch it and then you can slide the fuel line out. Hopefully I don't get sprayed here. Not too bad. Now to get the lower intake off, there are some bolts and nuts if you go all around this thing. I count 11 of them. I believe there's just 11. So anyway, get all those out and you'll be able to pull the intake off. You will need a 12mm socket to remove them. Put those 11 nuts and bolts out of the way. This guy is loose. I didn't really even have to pry on it or anything, so let's see if I can get this off with one hand here. Maybe. Yep. Now when you remove the bolts, you'll notice that there are long bolts and there are short bolts, and then there's two nuts. The long bolts go more toward the center of the intake, and the short bolts go on the outside like this. So there's gonna be two short ones here, 1, 2, 3 long ones, another short one, and then 1, 2 long ones here, and then the rest are short. Okay guys, we have opened up a can of worms here. Obviously Felpro, somebody has been here. And look at all that pink crusty coolant that's been leaking down there, guys. And this van was losing coolant. Look at all that buildup down there. So here once again, right, you think you're coming in here just replacing NOx sensors, and it ends up being a whole lot more. This coolant hose right here is gonna have to come off to get to the NOx sensors. And this hose is getting replaced, by the way. I mean, it's only like $20 at the dealer, something like that. Now, some of this coolant leak could be from this hose, but once I get this hose off, I will show you guys in a little better detail what more than likely is causing this leak right here, and it's not this hose, or at least it's more than just that hose. So let me get this off and I'll show you. Okay, I've got this coolant hose off, so now we can get in here and see a little better. So there's our NOx sensors. Here's 1 and there's 2. And so on this engine, bank 1 is going to be the rear by the firewall, and bank 2 is up here in the front, closer to the radiator. And the particular check engine light code that this van was actually throwing at first was for bank 2. But then after a while, it eventually started throwing it for bank 1 too. And now it has codes for bank 1 and 2. And if you notice here, this sensor says Denso on it. This is an original sensor. This is bank 2. This sensor right here, there's no name on it, there's no brand, and it's obviously been replaced. It's aftermarket. So I believe what's happened here is at one point somebody came in here and they only replaced one NOx sensor on bank 1. Then down the road, the check engine light came back on for the bank 2 NOx sensor, which they did not replace, which they should have at the same time. But it doesn't matter because that one's garbage too. It's throwing codes for that one as well. So what we're gonna do, guys, is we're not just gonna replace one sensor, and we're not just gonna replace 2 sensors. We're gonna replace both NOx sensors and the wiring harness to the NOx sensors. I mean, look at this. These things get brittle and they need to be replaced along with the NOx sensor. So it's getting 2 NOx sensors and the wiring harness. As you can see, it just goes and it plugs in right there. And as far as all our crusty pink coolant down here, these things kind of have a known issue. If you notice that there are some bolts down here, these little 10mm bolts, So I'm gonna get all this cleaned up to where you guys can see, but this is actually a plate that can be removed, and underneath it flows coolant. So what happens is on these a lot of times is this plate down here starts to seep coolant, and over time it builds up. A lot of times it starts running out this way down the side of the thermostat and down the front of the engine. And a lot of people, they misdiagnose it and they say, oh, it's a leaking thermostat, or this thermostat housing is cracked, which these do crack sometimes. But in this case, it's much more than that, because our issue is stemming from down here where this plate is. So I'm gonna get it cleaned up a little bit and show you guys later. But for now, let's go ahead and get these knock sensors out. So this harness is probably gonna break when I take it off, but I don't care because it's getting replaced. So I'm gonna unplug these sensors. Set that aside for now. Now these nuts that hold the knock sensor on, you'll need a 12mm socket or wrench to remove them. Remove the knock sensors. Okay, so I got my 2 old knock sensors out and I cleaned it up a little bit with a rag, because especially this one on bank 2, it was all covered in coolant, and it's even got some coolant down in where the connector goes. But as you can see, this is a Denso original, and it's even got the part number right there on the side. This was the one that was in bank 2. This is the one that it was mainly flagging at first on the check engine light code. But as you can see, this one right here is just some no name, no brand aftermarket. It's got no markings on it whatsoever, so I don't know what brand it is. But at this point, it's got codes for this one too. I just can't believe that somebody would have really gone through all that work only to replace one knock sensor and leave the other one in their original. It doesn't make any sense to me. These sensors, they do list at about $195 a piece, and the wiring harness for it lists at about $65. So that may be one reason. Somebody may have been trying to save some money. But honestly, to save $200 on a job like this, it's really not worth it in my opinion. Just do it right. That way you don't have to go back in there and do all your labor all over again. Now, the sensors that I bought to replace these, I actually did not buy them from Toyota. I bought them elsewhere. And if you look at it, it's Beck & Arnley. Here's the part number. Now you may be saying, hey, I thought you told us to buy OEM knock sensors. Well, let's open up the box and see what we have. Take the package out. Now what do you notice about this sensor here compared to the original one that was in the car? They are identical. And I don't know if you can see this, but even the little part number that's on the side here and here, it might be hard to see. Maybe you can see it a little bit better right there. The part numbers are identical. Everything about these sensors is identical because these are the original sensors. If you can find for these vehicles the Beck & Arnley sensor, it is the exact same thing as the sensor that you'll buy at the dealer. The only difference is at the dealer you pay $195 a piece for these. I paid about $55 or $60 a piece for these. I got them online. So guys, if you want to save yourself some money, then go that route and you'll have the same quality part for a third of the price. The wiring harness though, I did buy from the dealer. Here's the part number up there on the top. But let me get back to it. One thing also to keep in mind, these intake gaskets, you cannot actually remove them unless you unbolt this part right here. So there's a couple of more nuts you got to take off, remove this whole piece. But I'll get to that in a little bit. I'm actually going to spend some time. I'm going to clean all this up, and I'm probably going to end up resealing that plate down there, which I know is not really the point of this video. So I don't know how much time I'll spend filming that part of it. I'll probably just go through and give you guys the highlights. I'm going to go ahead and remove this piece now. So there's 2 nuts and 2 bolts to remove to get this piece off right here, as well as this bracket right here has got to be removed, and this coolant temperature sensor needs to be disconnected. So let me do all that and get this out of the way. Okay, so I got all that off, including the upper hose I pulled off. So let's get this little guy out of the way now. Better get these washers out too. I don't want those to get lost. There we go. Okay, I got a little bit more room now to scrape all this junk out. Okay, so I've cleaned it up as best as I can for now, so we can get a little bit of better look now of that plate. There's a bunch of 10mm nuts and bolts that hold this plate on, and the gasket is just silicone. So in order to reseal this plate, I'm gonna need to get this whole deal off. So the thermostat housing is gonna need to come off. There's 3 10mm nuts on there, and before I can pull the thermostat housing off, I'll need to get the upper radiator hose off. It's actually, that upper hose is actually leaking anyway. I confirmed that it's leaking some coolant out of there. It's been getting oil on it from the valve cover. And then that 12mm bolt right there is going to need to come off. All right, let's see if the thermostat housing will come off now. Now that I look at it, it does kind of look like that thermostat has been leaking too. But I remember on the last time I did one of these, I couldn't get it out without removing the starter because it hits on the starter. So now I'm gonna have to unbolt the starter. Okay, so I got these 2 bolts out that hold the starter in place. And now I removed this 10 that was here. I gotta move this plastic piece out of the way to where I can slide the starter back. So I don't know if you guys can see what in the world is going on, but I slid the starter out and now should be able to get this piece out now. Okay. That was kind of a pain to get out. But yeah, guys, these plastic thermostat housings on these, they're kind of known to crack and warp. So there is an aftermarket replacement. And the replacement piece is all aluminum, so that's kind of cool. So if you guys are gonna have to replace that piece, I would check into this for sure. Okay, now, so this plate that's right here in the middle, I've gotten all the nuts and bolts removed. I counted 10 of them. So let me see if I can get this thing off now. There we go. So this stud, I broke it free using a 3/16 socket. So hopefully this other one will break free the same way. Alright guys, I'm sorry, but I tried to get that stud out, but man, that stud is in there so tight, I could not get it out. But I was able to get enough clearance to slide it straight out through the back. I'll just have to be careful when I go to reinstall this, when I put the silicone, to make sure I don't smear the silicone. But anyway, as you can see, this is kind of what we're dealing with here. So all that old silicone is going to need to be scraped off and cleaned up. And on this piece itself, of course, on the bottom, there is a groove, but there is no gasket, it's just silicone. The groove is just so that the silicone can fit into. So all this is gonna get cleaned up, as well as this hose right here that goes to the throttle body. It's such a pain to get to this hose. I went ahead and ordered one, so I'm gonna replace this hose while I'm there, because the last thing I wanna do is get all this back together and this little hose leaks. And I've got a new thermostat for it as well. Okay guys, so I'm fast forwarding here. So I've got this all cleaned off here and I've got the groove cleaned out. As far as inside the groove here, I recommend just getting in there with a pick and scraping out as much of the silicone as possible. And on the rest of the surface, me personally, I like using a die grinder with a plastic bristle brush attachment. And because these bristles are plastic, it's not going to scratch or damage the aluminum in any way. If you guys don't have something like this, you can use some really fine grit sandpaper, like maybe 1000 grit. And before you go in with the sandpaper, take a plastic blade and scrape off all of the silicone residue, or you can use a razor blade as well. You just have to be careful not to gouge the material. And now over here, I've kind of done the same thing. I've scraped off all the silicone with a razor, and then just gone around with a actually with a scuffing pad and just clean the surface pretty well. There's still a little bit more I need to clean just to get it perfect. You see a couple little spots like that. but I'm gonna get that taken care of and we'll move on to the next step. And after you thoroughly remove all the old silicone and dirt and anything else that's in there, then I would take some brake cleaner on a rag and just kind of wipe it down. Make sure there's no water or oily residue on it. That way the silicone can have a good seal. Now, as far as the RTV silicone, this is what I'm going to be using. It's the Permatex Ultra Gray. I got this at O'Reilly's. This is the stuff that we use here at the shop for most gaskets. It's very, very good quality stuff. You can use this for oil pans, timing covers, or for what I'm using it here for coolant. It'll work just fine. This is really good stuff. All right, so I've run my bead of silicone. You just basically got to follow the groove. I know it's not the prettiest silicone job in the whole world, but it'll work fine. Now let me get this plate installed. Okay, and just a tip here, when you install the new knock sensors, as you can see, these are the new ones, you want the connector facing toward the front of the engine over here. Pretty much level with the cylinder head facing the front of the engine. And then the nuts, you want to tighten those to 14 foot-pounds. Now I found that it's much easier to get an inch-pounds torque wrench to fit in this area. So I just used a small inch-pound torque wrench and I converted it to foot-pounds. So 14 foot-pounds times 12 is 168 inch-pounds. So that's what I tighten these to. And on the new harness for the sensor, you'll notice that obviously one of the connectors is longer and the shorter one is labeled number 1, which corresponds to bank 1. And bank 1 on this engine is in the back and bank 2 is in the front. I'm sorry, it's kind of hard to film down here. I know the lighting isn't super great, but I got the wiring harness plugged in. Of course, there's a tab here where it connects to this coolant pipe or this housing. And then of course the wire runs over here. Now when you go to disconnect the old one, there is a little tab that's right here in the center where the connector fits into right here on the wiring harness. So when you remove the old harness, you'll have to take a little pick and stick it in there and then push the harness out through the back. And maybe when I install this here, you'll kind of see what I mean. So I'm gonna reinstall it this way here. Slide it up until it clicks into place. So you can kind of see way down there. When you remove the old one, you'll have to stick a pick down there to release that tab so you can push it out through the back. Okay, at this point you're good to get the intake gaskets installed. Make sure that the surfaces underneath are all cleaned off really well before you install them. Especially be careful around these coolant passages because you don't want any leaks afterwards. But afterwards you can install this coolant filler or outlet or whatever you call it. And then go ahead and torque the nuts and bolts, the 4 nuts and bolts down to 11 foot-pounds. Okay, next I've gone ahead and installed the bypass hose here. And one tip on this hose, it's almost impossible to slide the hose over the pipe without lubricating the inside of the hose a little bit. So I just use a small amount of deep creep, or you could probably use WD-42, but don't use a whole lot, just a very small amount just to lubricate it so you can slide it over. Otherwise, trust me, you're gonna have an impossible time getting that thing on. And one tip on these clamps that I'll show you, when you open the clamp up all the way, it locks like that, which is real nice. That way you can slide the clamp and put it exactly where you need to put it. And then when you want to release the clamp, all you have to do is take a small flathead screwdriver, stick it right in here and then give it a twist and it'll pop the clamp out. So just use 2 hands and just like that. I forgot to mention too on the intake gaskets, these are the old ones, but pay attention when you install them because they do have to go in a certain spot. So you see the hole over here with the funny shape, that one goes on the upper left corner. And then for the front bank, you have basically a square hole and then you have a rectangular hole. So just pay attention. you can look at the ports on the cylinder head and you can tell which goes where. So I've got the underside of the intake manifold cleaned off, especially around the coolant passages. You're gonna wanna be careful about that and get that all cleaned off. So I'm ready to get this intake back on. And I went ahead off camera and I removed the fuel rail and I replaced all the O-rings on the fuel injectors because they were pretty dry rotted. And when I tried to remove them, they just broke off in pieces. Just make sure that when you install the intake manifold that you don't pinch this wiring harness in any way. So just be mindful of that right here. And then remember, when you install your bolts, the long bolts go in the middle and the short bolts go on the outside edges. So make several passes, tighten each bolt a few turns until you snug it all down, and finally finish it off by torquing the bolts to 11 foot-pounds. Once you get all these bolts and nuts torqued down to 11 foot-pounds, go ahead and come back over here and recheck the torque on these 4 bolts here. Get this down to 11 foot-pounds as well. And I will be installing a new thermostat, and as you can see, you're gonna wanna clean out the groove where the thermostat gasket sits in there. So clean that out really well so you don't have any leaks. Okay, now when you install the thermostat, obviously put the gasket around the edge of the thermostat, and then when you install it, this little jiggle valve up here in the corner has to be facing the upper stud. So let me get this in and I'll show you what I mean. So this right here would be the proper orientation. As you can see, the jiggle valve is facing toward that upper stud. And as I mentioned earlier, I will be using this aluminum part as an upgrade. So I'm gonna get this installed, and the nuts need to get torqued down to 71 inch-pounds. And the torque for this bolt up here is gonna be 14 foot-pounds. Okay, so at this point, I've pretty much gotten everything taken care of that I need to. So I've got the lower intake on. I've gotten the injector O-rings replaced. I've gotten the spark plugs done. It's 200,000 miles, so it's due for that anyway. I've gotten all the broken coil connectors replaced, and I've reattached the heater hoses here. I've gotten my fuel line reconnected down here, and I've got a new PCV valve installed back here on this rear valve cover. And I've got new valve cover gaskets installed as well, because like I said earlier, that rear valve cover was leaking. The front one was starting to leak a little bit. I got the front one taken care of too, because now's really the best time to do it while I have all this apart. So once again, guys, just something to think about if you're doing this job. I didn't film myself doing all that because that's not really the point of the video. The video is supposed to be about knock sensors. So I've gotten the knock sensor part of it covered. I just sort of skipped over the other things. So really now what I want to do is I want to get that upper intake manifold installed. And I found 3 bolts that I believe will work for back here where my little brackets need to attach. And of course, make sure that your gasket surface here on the lower intake manifold is reasonably clean of dirt and grease and that type of thing. And this may sound pretty obvious too, but before you get that upper intake on, make sure that you reconnect your injectors and all your coils back there. I have made that mistake before, and it was not very fun to have to pull all of it back apart again just to reconnect some connectors. Don't forget too to reconnect this ground wire that goes here, and also don't forget your coolant temperature sensor connector right here as well. And one last thing real quick before we get this on, I would definitely replace this PCV hose as well. Get a new one from the dealer, because 9 times out of 10 when you go back together with the old one, you're gonna crack the hose because it gets so hard and dry rotted. Then you're gonna have a massive vacuum leak back here. So I would definitely go for a new PCV hose. And as you're installing this upper intake, you're gonna have to sort of install this into the PCV valve at the same time as you're putting it down for it to fit properly. Don't forget this little guy too before you start torquing the nuts and bolts down. Now, before I tighten any of these down, I'm gonna go ahead and reach back around behind and install those bolts for the brackets back there. Otherwise, if you tighten these bolts first, you're not gonna be able to get the holes to line up back there. Next, go ahead and get these bolts and those two nuts tightened up to 21 foot-pounds, and then come back in the back and then go ahead and finish snugging up those bolts, which I've already done at this point. So now I'm just gonna start getting everything reconnected, my coils, my injectors here, and start getting everything back how it was. I'm gonna get a new throttle body gasket on there too. Get my throttle body reinstalled here. Okay, so I got the throttle body resecured, and at this point I've put everything back together how it's supposed to be. I kind of skipped through the last few steps because it's basically the first 9 minutes of my video, you know, all over again, just in the reverse order. So I have to get the throttle body on, of course, get your breather hoses, your air box, everything reconnected. Make sure to get your mass airflow sensor plugged back in. Make sure all these little vacuum lines going to the air box are reconnected. And then of course, there is a ground wire right here that you're gonna wanna remember, don't forget that. Got this little air snorkel deal resecured. And then of course the wiper blades and the wiper cowling and all that has to be put back on. If you guys need any help with that, just refer back to the first 9 minutes of the video and you'll see how to take that off and put that back on. And finally, I got the engine cover back on, so we are good to go. As you can see, the van starts up, runs fine. So this van's been driven about 500 miles since I've done the repair. I have not had any check engine light return or any issue whatsoever. So we are good to go with this repair, guys. So if you guys want to do knock sensors on your Toyota 3.3, now you know how. So I appreciate you guys for watching. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.